Hola, necesitas sacar el paquete de gramática porque hoy vamos a tomar apuntes sobre los verbos reflexivos. We have a ton of reflexive verbs in this section's vocabulary, and we are finally going to learn how to conjugate them. You can recognize the reflexive verb because it has that se, that se, attached on to the infinitive form, like bañarse or acostarse. Reflexive verbs describe actions done to or for oneself. We have reflexive verbs in English too. You probably just didn't realize it. In English, reflexive pronouns end in self or selves. For instance, I bathe myself. And they show that the subject both does and receives the action of the verb. That is probably the most important rule when it comes to reflexive verbs, is that the subject both does and receives the action. In Spanish, all reflexive verbs are expressed with a reflexive pronoun. When a reflexive verb is in the infinitive form, the reflexive pronoun attaches to the end of the verb. For example, bañarse. You can see that reflexive pronoun se is attached directly onto the end of bañar, bañarse. However, when we have a conjugated reflexive verb, the reflexive pronoun goes before the conjugated verb. For example, me baño. I have conjugated the verb bañar. You will notice that my reflexive pronoun se was brought out in front of the reflexive verb, and I changed it to me, because we're going to learn in a second that me is the reflexive pronoun that you use when you're talking about yourself. You don't really have a space to write down my steps to conjugating a reflexive verb, but maybe see if there is some white space on the back of the grammar notes packet or off to the side where you can jot this down really quickly. We're going to use the verb bañarse as our example. The first thing I want to do is bring the reflexive pronoun se out in front of the verb. Then I'm going to conjugate the verb. Let's pretend I want to conjugate the verb bañarse into the yo form. I want to talk about how I bathe myself. And then I need to make sure that that reflexive pronoun agrees. Me baño. Because remember, the most important rule of a reflexive verb is that the subject both does and receives the action. Both the reflexive pronoun and the ending of the verb have to agree with the yo form, which they do. So, you probably have realized that reflexive pronouns, the me and the se, those are really important for reflexive verbs. So I'm going to show you all of the reflexive pronouns first. The yo reflexive pronoun is me. The tu reflexive pronoun is te. The él, ella, usted reflexive pronoun is se. The nosotros, nosotras reflexive pronoun is nos. And the ellos, ellas, ustedes reflexive pronoun is se as well. Uh-oh, it's the same for the él, ella, usted and the ellos, ellas, ustedes. You'll be able to differentiate though because the verb will have a different ending. So, if I want to say I bathe myself or I take a bath, I'm going to say me baño. Te bañas is what I would use if I wanted to tell you that you take a bath or you bathe yourself. If I'm talking about a boy or talking about a girl, I would say se baña to say that he bathes himself or she takes a bath. If I want to say we bathe ourselves, I'd say nosotros nos bañamos. And if I want to say they take a bath or they bathe themselves, I'm going to say se bañan. You need both parts to get points on a quiz or a test. To prove to me that you understand reflexive verbs, you need the little reflexive pronoun and you need the conjugated verb. If you leave one off, then you don't understand. So remember, you need both parts. So we have an example here. Jorgito takes a bath at 8. Remember the verb bañarse? Okay. I'm talking about Jorgito. So I'm going to say se baña. Jorgito se baña a las 8. Go ahead and copy down that example sentence. Jorgito se baña a las 8. Now, sometimes when a reflexive verb follows a conjugated verb, remember, I call this a verb phrase. When a verb follows a conjugated verb, that's what I call a verb phrase. What's a verb phrase? It's when you got two verbs, one's conjugated, followed by an infinitive. Okay. When a reflexive verb follows a conjugated verb, you want to make sure to use the correct reflexive pronoun with the infinitive. Remember, the reflexive pronoun always has to agree no matter what. So, our first example is when you can attach the pronoun to the infinitive. ¿A qué hora quieres despertarte? You'll notice that my reflexive pronoun te is attached onto the infinitive. This is, again, remember, what I call a verb phrase. Right here, quieres despertarte. That's a verb phrase. I got my conjugated verb followed by an infinitive. And I can attach that reflexive pronoun onto the end of the infinitive. I knew this was in the to form because it says quieres. So I knew that my reflexive pronoun needed to be te. Because remember, it's always got to agree. You can also place the pronoun way out in front before the conjugated verb. Me quiero despertar a las 7. So remember, this is my verb phrase. I have a conjugated verb followed by an infinitive. But in this example, I can put the reflexive pronoun way out in front. I knew that I was talking about how I wake up at 7 because quiero is in the yo form. So I made my reflexive pronoun agree and say me. It does have to go out in front though. Nothing can go in between here. Nothing. This is like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Nothing's going in between here, okay? So the me can go out in front though, way out in front before the conjugated verb. So the two places that a reflexive pronoun can go when we have what I call a verb phrase, a conjugated verb followed by an infinitive, it can either be attached onto the end of the infinitive or it can be placed way out in front before the conjugated verb. Some verbs are not always reflexive though. Let's take an example of the verb despertarse, which you learned this chapter. So in your mind, you're probably like, despertarse is always reflexive. Well, that's not necessarily true. Let's look at the first example sentence. Yo despierto a Celia a las 7. I wake up Celia at 7. Who is doing the action? I am. Okay. But who is receiving the action of being awakened? Celia is. Therefore, it can't be a reflexive verb because, remember, reflexive verbs, the subject both does and receives the action. So, this is an example of a verb that is not reflexive because I am waking Celia up. I'm not doing and receiving. However, if I wake myself up at 7, yo me despierto a las 7. Who does the action? I do. Who receives the action of being awakened? I do as well. Oh, well then that, yes, is an example of a reflexive verb. Another example might be when I say, I bathe myself. Yo me baño. Who does the action? I do. Who receives the action of being bathed? I do. But then at the same time, every night, I gotta give Sophia a bath before bedtime. So I would say, yo baño a Sofía. Who does the action? I do. Who receives the action? Sophia does. Therefore, in that second example, it's not a reflexive verb.